ThatCamp, the Humanities and Technology Camp, is an attempt to invent human intercourse for scholars and for all those engaged in the humanities, including museum professionals, librarians, archivists, software developers who work in cultural heritage institutions, graduate students, faculty, instructional technologists, you name it. The word invent is especially appropriate since the unconference may and indeed has been considered a kind of a technology. This book, Open Space Technology, A User's Guide, it's currently its third edition in 2008. It's actually originally published in 1992, and the ideas that it embodies were developed in the 1980s. And in fact, despite its deceptive title, this is a book about new models of conferences, new models of meeting. And in fact, the sort of keystone to open space technology is sitting in a circle. That is what it's about. It is a new form of conferencing for industry, for business, for science. And as I said, developed in the 80s, became quite popular, particularly in science and technical and software development circles. This is a meeting at NASA, an open space technology meeting at NASA that took place in 2010. It's still being used as a model today. Unconferences, generally, camps, new models of meeting, new models of conferring, have been obviously in the air since 1934 when Virginia Woolf first posed the question, why? Why do we continue to have lectures? Why can't we simply talk to one another? But I think it's fair to say that it really is only in the last 20 or so years that, and particularly since about 2002, that the notion of unconference has really grown legs, as it were. Certainly the impulse has been there, but there are now models for this. There are scripts for this. I'll give you, this book is one that will tell you a little bit about this movement. ThatCamp is mentioned in this book. I think it was written in 2010, just before ThatCamp really took off. But it mentions there are many kinds of new forms of interaction, new forms of scholarly communication, professional communication, professional development, and it's worthwhile researching them. And I will tell you a little bit about ours. Some of you may know the media guru and futurist Tim O'Reilly. He is a publisher of O'Reilly Books, which in particular do a great deal of publishing of technology manuals, very good manuals. But they are sort of a media empire, and one of the things that they have been doing for many years is conferences of various kinds. In 2002 was founded the Friends of O'Reilly Camp, FOO Camp. Some of you may know that foo and bar are standard generalized variable names, a bit like Jane Doe and John Doe for computer programming. FOO Camp, F-O-O Camp, stood for Friends of O'Reilly, but was also a sort of a technology joke. FOO Camp was, as you can kind of see in the CNN article from 2004, after it had, in the second year, FOO Camp was literally a camp. People had intense conversations in tents, I like to say. Get it? Yes, thank you. You can see the tents. And it was an invitation-only conference. It was an unconference in the sense of, there's no agenda. People show up, and then they figure out what they're going to do or talk about. Again, influenced by things, earlier models like open space technology, Tim O'Reilly said, we're going to have this rather than a more traditional conference with presentations, with lectures. In 2005, there was an alternative to FOO Camp. It was probably inevitable. If FOO Camp comes, can BarCamp be far behind? But particularly Chris Messina decided to have a BarCamp because they were somewhat annoyed at the exclusivity of FOO Camp. because it was invitation only, and had the reputation of having A-list people from the kind of Silicon Valley culture, the inventor of RSS, and Dave Weiner, and the inventor of XML. These were the kinds of people who would go to Foo Camp. And of course, they would blog about their experiences and get a great deal of publicity for it, while at the same time, it's still a very sort of exclusive kind of event. So software development and Silicon Valley culture being what it was, some of them, particularly Chris Messina, said, we want to do this unconference thing, and we want to open it to everybody and make it free and make it available. So you may be able to read some of this article. We set out to prove that what the good folks at O'Reilly could pull off in a year with a couple years' experience and tens of thousands of dollars could be cobbled together in a week by a crazy gaggle of savvy geeks, leveraging only the web and our reach into social networks. So this is 2005. The invention of BarCamp. And all this kind of thing sort of plays out in the technology media. BarCamp still exists. If you go to barcamp.org, you will see that people are still having BarCamps. It is a very, very global movement. There are a lot of, there tend to be a lot of BarCamps in Asia, Africa, India, in addition to some in the United States. You can see that they did a great deal of their organizing and indeed their publicity with a wiki. We'll talk a little bit more about how the technologies play into these new models of conversation, new models of conferring. One interesting little tidbit of technology history. Those of you who do use Twitter may know that the hashtag, which I talked about at the very beginning of the session, is what you use to, it's a form of metadata. It's a form of arranging things into groups, topical groups. It was actually Chris Messina, the inventor of BarCamp, who invented the hashtag as part, so that they could thread conversations on Twitter, which was then a very, very, very new tool, around BarCamp. You see, if you can see the date on this tweet, it's the 23rd of August, 2007. This is before Twitter sort of, was at all well known by anybody. And it's sort of part of Twitter lore that, many of its conventions that are now programmed into the technology were sort of organically invented by users. So, Twitter and unconferences, it may not be a historical accident that they kind of grew up together. Computer programmers have always had Twitter-like technologies, such as IRC. I don't know if anybody is into using the internet relay chats these days, but it's fundamentally, it's a lot like, just your general IMing, your general GChat, whatever it is you do, except that you can do it in groups. So again, it's quite similar to Twitter, except that IRC channels are private. You have to know which room to go into. They're maybe a little bit more like Usenet news scrapes, but they have that real-time back and forth. And what I think Twitter did that was kind of amazing was really make a public global chat room. And hashtags, although we don't think of them that way now, were the way of kind of setting rooms, topics, areas for a global chat room in which you can talk about a particular topic. People are still replying to this message, which is amusing. It's sort of a well-known tweet. It is still online. You can find the URL for it. And people will write him and say, no, I think that's a terrible idea. Well, it's too late. It's now encoded into everything. But it was around the BarCamp movement. It was because of the BarCamp movement by the inventor of ThatCamp. Of BarCamp. The inventor of BarCamp was also the inventor of the hashtag, which I think is kind of amazing. And at the same time, entirely unsurprising. So if you've kept the chronology in mind, you have OST, mid-'80s, early '90s. You have Foo Camp, 2002 was the first one. BarCamp, which was also an unconference but open to everybody and self-evidently more, I guess you would have to say, more impoverished, poorer. That's 2005. At the Center for History and New Media at George Mason University, where I now am employed, they had been following all of this, and by the time they had the first ThatCamp, the Humanities and Technology Camp in 2008, they had been meaning to do it for a few years. They saw that BarCamp happened in 2005 and said, you know what, we need one of those. We need that. We want one, we need to do it. Some of you, if you've been at all familiar with WordPress, you may recognize the very visually recognizable WordPress blog theme. The first ThatCamp happened in 2008. Lisa Spiro was there. You can ask her questions if you like afterward about what that was like. It is documented. Actually, at that point, this was sort of the rise of blogging on there. Everybody blogged it afterward. Certainly you blogged during it, but almost everybody wrote long, long blog posts about it. In fact, I owe my current employment to Lisa, I was telling her earlier, because she wrote a wonderful blog post recounting her experiences at ThatCamp. And I read that. In fact, I thought I had a slide of that, but perhaps not. At any rate, I read that blog post and said, I need to go to that as well. And so I went to the second ThatCamp, which also happened at the Center for History and New Media, but in 2009. And 2009, as Brian also knows, was a bit of a watershed year. It was one of the years in which, it was certainly the year where I first discovered Twitter. And there were a number of things in digital humanities happening at the same time. This ThatCamp happened right after the big digital humanities conference, which in this year was just up the road from CHNM at the University of Maryland. So the conference called Digital Humanities is in alternate years in North America, and then in other years it's in Europe. And that year it happened to be not only in the United States, but right up the street from the Center for History and New Media. So there were many people who went to both, who went to the ACH, as it was then called, and then came to ThatCamp. And at both of those events, people were beginning to use Twitter a lot. Twitter was by no means mainstream. This was before Oprah, but it was beginning to be better known in just sort of a general tech-savvy community. You can kind of see, you can see some people tweeting here. Those are not 2009 tweets. We have embedded Twitter feeds on all of the ThatCamp websites. Our own hashtag ThatCamp still gets a great deal of traffic. And that for me, and then later at MLA in December, Brian was on a panel about Twitter and with a number of other people. And so it was one of these, I think that the rise of Twitter and the rise of unconferences together helped. I think one of them, certainly Twitter, helped the unconference movement. ThatCamp was very much modeled on BarCamp in the sense, it still is, in the sense that the agenda is created when you get there. It is also on the model of ThatCamp in the sense that it is open to anybody, that it is free, or these days as close to free as you can make it. We have allowed people to sort of do small fees, but our sense was that we didn't want things to be costing $200 per person, partly because of the sense that people were impoverished, that graduate students in particular were impoverished, and that they had very little chance to get training in the digital humanities. And that even, I could give an entire other presentation on the digital humanities and money. Suffice it to say that even though there may be more money in the digital humanities than there are in other parts of the humanities, there's also never enough money in the digital humanities because it's so expensive to do, right? It's expensive to take the time to learn it. It's expensive to take the time to get the technology. Many digital humanities projects would ideally have very talented developers working on them. Those people can make a great deal more money working in private industry. So how do you pay them the salary that they're used to getting? So it's certainly not the case that the digital humanities is poor, but it is the case that digital humanities, let's say, has a cash flow problem sometimes. This is the kind of thing that happens at ThatCamp. I'm going to talk a little bit about this configuration. I often tell people these days when I'm trying to explain what ThatCamp is or what an unconference is, which I find myself having to do less and less often these days. But nevertheless, I still sometimes do have to explain it. And I find that the easiest way to explain it is that an unconference is to a conference what a seminar is to a lecture. In our undergraduate and graduate educations, we understand that difference. We have encoded, if you will, that distinction into our curricula. We have lectures. Lectures are good for certain things. We have seminars. Seminars are good for certain things. In the area of what you might call professional development, the seminar structure is rarer. There are symposia, there are colloquia, which really are structured in a very informal way. But in general, most people's disciplinary meetings, MLA, AHA, and all of the sort of smaller, more specific disciplinary meetings still tend to be run on more or less a lecture model, a panel model. People write their papers and read them. In some of those hotel rooms, even the notion of having PowerPoint slides is still quite unusual, which to be honest, I would much rather listen to a well-read paper, a well-written paper be read than to sit in a room where someone reads to me the text that is on the screen. That drives me crazy. So at any rate, this kind of session at ThatCamp is something that is rare, is surprisingly rare. In just general scholarly experience once you are out of graduate school. There's no excuse for this image to be there. This is, Jeremy Boggs is one of the inventors of ThatCamp. Dave Lester is another. They were both graduate students at the Center for History and New Media and were mostly responsible, they were certainly responsible for the name, the Humanities and Technology Camp, which apparently they came up with it at Midnight Denny's. This is Jeremy's father wearing a ThatCamp t-shirt. So I like to think of this as, you know, again, the financial issues are interesting, but you know, this is a sort of ThatCamp has, in a way, a kind of a working class ethic, I feel like. You can argue with that, but it was always founded on a certain amount of opposition, not total opposition, not revolution, but a certain amount of opposition to large disciplinary conferences that are expensive to get to and expensive to register for. Understanding that there is a great dearth, and expensive to put on. Expensive clothes, as Virginia Woolf said, expensive food, that kind of thing. Dork shorts are our concession to the lecture. They are exactly the same as lightning talks, if you have heard of that. This is the dork short board from, I can't remember if this is 2000. It is 2008, okay. The one where I wasn't. In a dork short, you are allowed to speak for 2 or 3 minutes only. I love dork shorts, because usually what happens is people says, here's my thing I'm working on. And you're like, I didn't know that existed. That's all I need to know. If I need to know more, I will go to the website. I will, you know, you learn such a great deal. Talk about efficiency, talk about time. Tremendous thing. They're exactly the same as lightning talks. These are the founders, Jeremy Boggs and Dave Lester. Jeremy Boggs is now working at the Scholars Lab at UVA. Dave Lester is in Information Science School at Berkeley. Here's another sort of image of what a ThatCamp session looks like. At this point, I think this I think is actually lunch. We're lunch with laptops kind of a thing. Probably most people have eaten, but we're waiting for one or other kind of session. So there have been 2 ThatCamps in the summer of 2009. Ben Brumfield and a number of other people who had been to the first ThatCamp, Jean Kramer Smythe, most of whom I think had sort of archival backgrounds, said the way everybody says, almost everybody says when they go to ThatCamp, we want one too. They didn't want to wait for another year. They didn't want to travel. They said, you know, we're all going to SAA, the Society for American Archivists, in Austin this year. Why don't we do a ThatCamp before SAA. So they put together ThatCamp Austin, which was the first non-CH&M ThatCamp. It's the sort of viral genealogy we're doing here. After that, there were a number of other sort of, you might say, organically formed ThatCamps, people just saying, I can do this. I like to tell people also that a ThatCamp is about, in terms of difficulty of organizing, it's about twice as hard as having a party and about half as hard as having a wedding. It's on a human scale. You don't need an organization in order to do it. You need a few dedicated people. Ideally, you need a couple of $1,000s. People have done it on what might as well be no money. People have done it on $500. Here's where the principles of ThatCamp kind of hit the road. This was all sort of organic and semi-formulated at this point. Historically, we're in late 2009. An open, so that's one, inexpensive, that's another, meeting where humanists and technologists of all skill levels, that was a bit new. I really think that ThatCamp originally had been, in a way, for advanced people. It was for people originally who were doing digital humanities and wanted a more informal way to talk to one another than the big digital humanities conference. What with the popularization of ThatCamp and with everybody's, I think, full approval, we decided that ThatCamp was a really good educational opportunity. And in fact, ThatCamps have become one of the places where people pick up, for basically no money, a few digital humanities skills. They get to learn at least a little bit about a few tools, that kind of thing. Those principles are, we have trademarked the name ThatCamp at the Center for History and New Media in order to, and not in order to make money off it, but for the opposite reason, to ensure that we can enforce our principles, which once or twice we have had to do. We don't let anyone have institution-specific ThatCamps. We don't let anyone have society-specific ThatCamps. There are an increasing number of ThatCamps that are held in conjunction with other meetings, and it can always be a little logistically difficult. We say, it's fine for you to publicize it mostly to the members of the MLA. That's okay. You just have to be, if you're talking about, literature and technology, there are only so many people who are going to be interested in that anyway. But we really wanted to make sure that people who were not, if you're not a member of the MLA, you don't get excluded from this kind of thing. So free, we did actually, we're not uncompromising. We compromised on the free. We wanted to say it has to be free, but a lot of people just said, look, we want to provide coffee and food, and we're like, oh, well, coffee. Okay, well, you can provide coffee. We're all in favor of that. So we're like up to $30. Okay, you can charge people that. Even an impoverished grad student can probably afford that. Open, informal. We're also, we fudge things a little bit in terms of no presentations, no talking heads. Brian had that great image of the what did you call it, the lonely scholar, the great mind, the great genius. We have begun incorporating skills training workshops. And often the most efficient way to do that is for somebody to stand up and say, here's how you do this. But we even try to encourage as much as we can for those workshops to have a lot of hands-on work. Public, they're self-organizing. All of these principles have spawned a lot of ThatCamps. I actually hate the word spawned, and people, I think, overuse it. But it feels like that, to be honest. It feels like tadpole eggs. Seeing the organic spread of ThatCamp that began with ThatCamp Austin, the clever and opportunistic minds of the Center for History and New Media said, you know what, this should be a grant. We should get some money to support this in the style to which it should be accustomed. So Tom Scheinfeld wrote a grant to the Mellon Foundation, which we've already heard a lot about, proposing a way to sort of institutionalize ThatCamp. We got a 2-year grant in 2010 from the Mellon Foundation that did 3 things primarily. It hired me. I am ThatCamp coordinator. It provided a little bit of fellowship money. We were giving little $500 grants that would enable graduate students to go to ThatCamps. And it provided money for us to kind of set up the platform for ThatCamp, which I'll talk a little bit more about again later. We decided not to standardize on the wiki. There is a ThatCamp wiki. It hasn't been getting used at all. We decided to use the WordPress blogging platform, which has actually been really great for us. And so for the first 2 years, that was pretty much what we were doing, setting up this means by which people could organize their own ThatCamp. Talk about collaboration. I actually feel sometimes like I am the least collaborative person in the world because everyone else, it's a distributed model. I do very little. I have almost nothing to do with most ThatCamps. They are locally organized, locally run, locally financed, usually. And what I have been doing is setting up this platform that helps people and then writing help documents and instructions and that kind of thing. And then we were very prescient. We wrote me in a big travel budget so that I can go to ThatCamp. I've just used it up, by the way. But I used up about 2 years in 1 year this phase, so that I can go and help people run the ThatCamp if they're at all nervous about the new model. So I've been doing that, and it has been a really, really successful model. As I said, we tied the fellowships in the first 2 years of funding to whether or not a ThatCamp had workshops. And this was precisely because we wanted to leverage ThatCamp, as it were, as a place for education to happen. But it is also a place where conversations happen. And I actually want to talk a little bit in my remaining time about this early ThatCamp motto, which some of you may be familiar with. CHNM is actually, it's phenomenal at marketing, and one of the cornerstones of marketing is a jingle or a motto. One of the early sort of mottos of ThatCamp was this: more hack, less yak, or the other way around, less yak, more hack. You can see this is 2010 that he's tweeting this, but at that point it was already, there's Brian. Brian favorited it or retweeted it, apparently. And I understood where that was coming from, but I never liked it as a motto. And in fact, because I am in control of ThatCamp, I am ThatCamp, as it were, I got to de-emphasize this. Now, more hack, less yak meant that there was another ethos of ThatCamp that said things should be productive. You should be making things at ThatCamp. You should be building things at ThatCamp. But what I noticed very early on was that although people did want to do that, and although that was really useful, people also were desperate to sit around and talk with one another about the problems they were having with technology, especially in groups that were interdisciplinary and indeed interprofessional. So you would have librarians and graduate students and faculty in other disciplines all talking together in a very mandatorily unscripted way. Because we wouldn't allow people to do presentations, they had to kind of be open and vulnerable about, I don't know how to deal with this. Most conferences, most lectures are, one person saying, I have answers. I am a prophet. I am a prig. I'm going to tell you what to do. Inevitably, I felt, because I am a humanist, that the mere fact of conversations were themselves productive. So I began, erasing this motto from everywhere I could find it. It still persists. There's nothing wrong with that. And I absolutely do think that when it's possible to have productive sessions where you make things, sessions where you build things, that can be very, very useful as well. But I think, ThatCamp always kind of meant less yakking from one single person to an attentive audience. But I think I worried about it as a motto because I was afraid it was going to put a chilling effect on conversation. I wanted to have a little fun with Google Ngrams now. Looking up the word yak in the OED. There's an obsolete definition at the top, but if you can see a little bit at the bottom, really the word comes into its current meaning actually in the late 40s or early 50s. Their first example is 1950. I'm sure many of you know the Google Ngrams tool, which is your way of graphing phrases or words over time. So if you begin, I began in 1930, partly because of the date of that Virginia Woolf essay. So that Virginia Woolf essay is 1934. I first wanted to establish which spelling was correct, and despite the OEDs, saying that YACK is the more common spelling, at least in this conjugation, I find that YAKK is the more common spelling. So the blue line is YAKK, and the red line is YACK. So I've decided to use that spelling. But then I wanted to look a little bit, I wanted to see whether I could confirm my sense that this was a gendered term, yakking. So I have she yacked, which is blue, he yacked, which is red, they yacked, which is yellow. I think you can, this is not a graph of the patriarchy that is staring us in the face. I like to think that it confirms in some small way my sense that the term yakking is a little bit gendered, that sitting around talking is something that women are understood to do, and that it's a negative, has a negative connotation. I took out the they just to make the gendering a little bit more clear. It's weird that there's a spike in she yacked in the 70s. There could be any number of reasons for this. These tools are so vague, and one should never make conclusions on them, and yet one always does. It could be something to do with the rise of feminism in the 70s. Who knows? It could be one particular text. You never know. However, there's a little bump in the 80s. I was thinking about that as, I don't know, Wall Street tycoons like sitting around. I don't know. Who knows why these things bump a little bit. But because I felt that this term yak was a little bit dismissive and a little bit reinforcing of an overly male culture, I wanted to make sure that we made room for all kinds of sessions at ThatCamps, including yakking sessions. We're just going to sit around and talk to each other. You get to know people so well out of that camp. You really do. Particularly even when it's only a day, but when it's more than 2 days, by the end of it, you really have made some good friends. So this is a fairly recent schema that I invented. I actually had originally invented a schema, and it was a bit too complicated, and it wasn't in a lot of use. But this has actually been being used recently. I would say over the last few months, people are really beginning to use these. And there are categories. You can categorize your session proposals. So I've put a little bit of structure on it. These are all optional. But as you can see, I say, well, you can out of that camp, one of the things you can do is talk. You can yak. You can sit around in a circle and talk. You can also make something, code, even write. You can teach things. That's our concession to workshops. Sometimes some of the workshops, mostly the workshops are pre-scheduled, but sometimes people offer to teach things that they just happen to know how to do, and other people express interests. Playing sessions. I wanted to give you some examples of some of those sessions. Again, I kind of wanted to show you an image like this because this is such a sort of a tip. I've been to a lot of ThatCamps. It's in the 20 range. I need to go back and count at some point. I've been to certainly more than a dozen ThatCamps, maybe 15, 17, somewhere around like that. And I have noticed that the default kind of session is this, sitting around talking with laptops. And Twitter. You can even see he's got a Twitter thing open so that the conversation is happening in multiple dimensions. This is ThatCamp Paris last year. However, there are other sessions like this. I don't know whether you would call this a make session or a play session, but recently there was a kind of a tripartite ThatCamp Feminisms, just March 15th. They had, on simultaneous days, they had one in the East at Barnard, I think it was at Barnard, I've forgotten. One in the East, one in the West, one in the South. And one of the things they did was, it's sort of well known that Wikipedia editors are overwhelmingly male. And they said, okay, one of the things we can do out of that camp is just have an edit-a-thon. Let's all sit around and write things on Wikipedia that are from our point of view, that are about feminism or that are about women's topics. So that's not just sitting around talking. That's actually productive. That is a less yak, more hack type of session. Here's another kind of play session. I was at this ThatCamp recently, ThatCamp Lehigh Valley. One of the common, I suppose, buzzwords in digital humanities is crowdsourcing. In a way, ThatCamp is a bit crowdsourced. I'm sure you all know what it is. But Rob Weidman proposed that we actually just sit around for an hour and play with these tools. And I did that, and it was so much fun. It's so great. You know, so we were mostly working with transcription tools. So you go somewhere, like I think there's one on the next slide. The New York Public Library Menus Project is a really well-known one. New York Public Library has a lot of menus in its collections. They need them transcribed. So they open them up to the world via the web and say, hey, come type in what our menus say for us. But I think it was I did the DIY history at University of Iowa, which is a lot of, so I transcribed a Civil War letter while I was sitting there. This is not a talking session, this is a doing session. But Rob, I thought it was interesting that he proposed both a talking session and a playing session. Let's go talk about like the meaning of crowdsourcing or how do you do it, but let's also just do it. And it was tremendous, I loved it. ThatCamp College Art Association in January in New York. One of the most popular sessions, and in fact one of the most sort of, well, retweeted sessions, but the site also got a lot of hits, was a session that somebody proposed to create an art history flash book. Actually, I should have showed you the session proposals, but it's just kind of a neat site. So this is a free, open, online textbook that was created in an hour. It is a proof of concept. You probably wouldn't want to use it in a class, but the whole point was, like, okay, let's get a bunch of art historians in a room and sit down and put together a textbook. Everyone will work independently to contribute. It's actually just links, mostly. They're not writing articles, but they're what are some links to great resources in this particular area of art. And actually, one of the things that was most interesting about that to me was how well a session like that runs when you have a really strong facilitator. In a way, it's not, when you talk about this kind of thing, it can all sound kind of loosey-goosey and overly democratic and unstructured, and sometimes it is. But in general, sessions like this, need somebody to assign work. They need essentially a project manager. Here is what we are going to do, and here's how we are going to do it. This was a really successful session, and it was really thrilling. And I think what people said too, we did a little bit of like lessons learned after this. So number one, it's just kind of fun to sit around and work. And we have this like seed of a resource that was created in an hour that we could then build out. But what people said at the end of it was, what this session taught me is that there aren't enough free, open art history resources online. There need to be, like, where's the stuff to link to? So it was like an object lesson in that kind of thing. So here's the point. Printing, copying, I'm reading you the slide now, just for emphasis. First time all hour, I think I'm allowed. Printing, copying, recording, broadcast technologies did not replace the lecture. Social media will not replace the seminar. Technologies will always augment and never supplant human presence. We're always going to need meetings. We're always going to need in-person meetings. And I think we're always going to need in-person meetings of both kinds. I'll go back to this. We're going to need lectures, and we're going to need new models like unconferences, because I think that even, I actually think that in a digital age, once the digital age makes the human presence more valuable, actually. You could have gone and read that Virginia Woolf essay on your own. I don't think it would have been the same. I think we've all had a collective experience. Maybe it was a horrible experience for you. I hope it wasn't. Like sitting there listening to me read. Perhaps you were so frustrated. Why is she doing this? Couldn't we just go read it? But nevertheless, the fact that we've all had that collective experience together of listening to those words and thinking about them and thinking whatever it is we're about them is irreproducible in an online world. And I think that's one reason why the lecture has not gone away. I absolutely think that even the in-person lecture, certainly the videotaped lecture, does also need to be augmented by other forms of in-person communication. Why not invent human intercourse? I think we finally have invented a kind of human intercourse with ThatCamp. Many scholarly associations, even those that are not having ThatCamps, are introducing new formats, roundtables, workshops, all kinds of things. They said, you know what, maybe we've done the standing up, reading a paper thing for a little bit too long. Let's try some other things. Let's get a little mixed bag of tricks here. So I just wanted to end up by actually talking a little bit about technology and what technologies can do to augment different forms of scholarly conversation, of human intercourse. Because it is always human intercourse, even when we are not all in the same room. ThatCamp.org runs on 2 technologies. Well, 3, I suppose. Well, the first thing is it runs on WordPress, which is a blogging platform primarily, although it is also the platform that is the most popular one for just building websites in general. It began as a blogging technology, but really has now since become what we call a content management system. It's just a website building tool. So there's that. But the specific modifications of WordPress that we use are both meant to increase the conversational abilities of what WordPress can do. So ThatCamp.org is what's called a multi-site network. And just what that means is that there are, everybody can have their own ThatCamp site. I think I set the transition speed on these things to be far too slow. This is just, I just wanted to give you a sense of everybody's got their own ThatCamp site. These all run on ThatCamp.org, almost all of them. That was actually an external one. ThatCamp Games, I know, poor Lee had some trouble having an external site not on ThatCamp.org. We certainly don't require you to have a site on ThatCamp.org, but we make it easy for you to do so and to customize it and to have kind of your own space. And this is enabled by the WordPress multi-site. All right, so ThatCamp ACRL is coming up. This is what it looks like on the back end. I am the network administrator. There's a couple of other, and there are just a lot of sites that are on ThatCamp.org. And I think we've solved most of our problems with giving help to people who want to have their own external site. The other technology that we use to kind of manage scholarly conversations around ThatCamp is BuddyPress, which is also just a thing that's baked. It's not baked into WordPress, but it's for WordPress. One of the chief developers for BuddyPress is a lapsed academic, Boone Gurgis, who was working toward a PhD in philosophy when he suddenly and accidentally turned into a web guru. I don't think it's any accident, really. And indeed, you study a lot of logic in philosophy, and there's a lot of logic in programming. It makes a lot of sense. But he is one of the lead developers for BuddyPress. He built it originally, was helping develop it for CUNY, their massive university networks. And we hired him to implement it on ThatCamp.org, and we're doing a little bit more development. We've launched a lot of it, but there's a little bit more stuff to come. One of the things that allows people to do, there's a stream on our site now where you can see everything that's going on all around the network, so different sites. I'm not sure anybody's watching this but me, but I have to say it's pretty neat. And then if you want, you can sort of manage other sort of social media things. Like you can friend people who've written posts and so on. And actually the main thing we're doing is we're kind of, I don't know the technical term, but we're sort of sucking it down to the individual sites, because this right now is only on ThatCamp.org. So our goal is you can be on your own ThatCamp site, somebody writes a post, and you're like, oh, I just need to kind of bookmark that person so that I know how to get in touch with them later when I want to have a project with them. So in terms of technology, we're doing whatever we can to make sure that the technology is going to help people kind of keep in touch with each other and have conversations. Our second round of funding from 2010 to 2012 has been all about the Cheetos, in Brian's metaphor. It's been all about sustainability. My job for the first 2 years was to enable ThatCamp, to facilitate ThatCamp. I thought it was going to be to evangelize ThatCamp, and instead I wound up just trying to keep up with all of the ThatCamps. I'm like, there was no evangelizing happening. I was like, oh my God, not another ThatCamp. But what we've been doing for the last 2 years is ensuring that ThatCamp can happen without grant funding. And I'm actually, it's going to happen, and it's going to happen well, and I'm very excited about it. So, even though I'll be sorry not to be working on the project anymore. So we're about 1 year through the second round of funding. The second round of funding was 2012 to 2014. So part of that was implementing these kind of social media technologies, really getting some web development going that can help sustain the conversations. We've got brand new forums, which at some point I'm going to make people use. So instead of me answering everybody's questions by email, we will shove that out to the open web and make people answer everybody's questions on the forums. We're also putting together a ThatCamp Coordinating Council, which will be made up primarily of people who have organized ThatCamps and who are devoted to the ThatCamp community. We are also putting together an invitation-only ThatCamp. It may be the only invitation-only ThatCamp there ever will be, but we're going to have a thing tentatively named ThatCamp Leadership next fall, in which we invite particularly graduate deans and heads of museums and heads of libraries and heads of scholarly associations who don't already know about ThatCamp, or who at least have not already sort of counted themselves as converts, to give them the experience of what it's like. Because what we've found over and over again is that once people go to ThatCamp, they never go back, in the sense of they become converts to ThatCamp. They say, oh, I need one of those. I need more of those. I need to go to more of those. It's a little embarrassing sometimes from our evaluations. We have some evaluations that we do for all ThatCamps. We have a fairly low response rate. But basically, last I checked, it was a 94% people agreeing or strongly agreeing that the ThatCamp was useful for them. It's pretty hard to beat that rate. There's always a few people, there's always a few sessions that don't go so, that are not so great. But it's been very successful, and we anticipate that it will continue to be very successful. And I think that's really all I have to say for you.